Here, let's draw the conclusion of this very important chapter, okay, about Keynesian economics. And we start with the some simple definitions about business cycle, right? We talk about contraction and expansion, how we define it, or how MBR define it, right? And after that, we check out the relationship between employment and output. Okay, we found a negative relationship between these two, which is so-called Oken's law, right? And after that, we introduced the most important model here in this chapter, which is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Okay, we start talking about these with the difference between the regular demand and the aggregate demand. Also, the difference between the regular supply and the aggregate supply, right? We also discussed the factors that could affect aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Okay. And after that, we put these two together and find the equilibrium output level, which is a potential GDP, and the equilibrium overall price level, right? All right. After that, we use the AD and AS model to identify a recession, right? To show you, the different recessions or different expansions. Okay, and on the top of that, we talk about the government responses to the contractions. Okay, uh, and the expansions, of course. It's so-called the stabilization policies. Okay, and uh, later in this chapter, we'll discuss the problems or the concerns about these stabilization policies. Okay. Do they really make the economy stabilized or actually destabilize the economy? Okay, I don't want to draw that specific conclusion for you. I want to leave that for you to make your own judgment. Okay. Um, However, here I do want to talk about an interesting Fred chart. Okay, hopefully this will stimulate more deep thinking about this issue. Okay, now what I'm pulling out here with the Fred is the real GDP. Okay, the vertical axis is a compounded annual rate of change. In other words, this is a growth rate, annualized growth rate of GDP. Okay, because remember, GDP number is reported every quarter, right, by Bureau of Economic Analysis. So we have to convert it to the annualized rate of growth. Okay. Now I'm taking the longest possible period so that we can look at the longer term trend. Okay, so this is from right after the World War II all the way to the most recent quarter. Okay, in 2022. You see these shaded areas. Upon this moment, you should know that they are the recessions, right? Here, I would strongly encourage you to pause the video and use your own observation and think about what you can find over time, especially about the stabilization of the economy. Okay, do you find that the economy is becoming more stabilized or destabilized based upon this chart? Okay, once again, pause the video right now and think about it. Okay. All right. Hopefully you would find that right after the World War II, we find a relatively larger fluctuation of the economies, right? Sometimes when the economy does pretty well, the growth rate could stay above 15% per year, right? Sometimes the economy suffers. The growth rate could be negative 10%. Okay, so we see larger swings in late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, even 1980s. But interestingly, starting from 1980s, we actually find the fluctuations of the growth rate becomes smaller, right? So again, right from this point and after that, you find less fluctuations in both ways. In other words, that we, you know, barely see that the economy could grow more than 10%, right? Um, Probably the only exception here is the right after the pandemic, right? We also, barely see the economy um, kind of shrank by approximately 10%, right? And the only exception here would be, this again during the pandemic and the 07-08 financial crisis. Okay, actually, we see fewer negative growth of the GDP after 1980s, right? Only a few occasions, several quarters, compared to before 1980s, we see that much more often, right? So Keynesian economists often take this as a very supportive evidence of the Keynesian stabilization policies. Okay, they believe this is just because of the stabilization policies, so we kind of make the economy or the growth of the economy more smooth. Okay, and of course, the pandemic is an exception, right? It kind of beats everything else. But remember, the pandemic is more of the public health crisis than an economic crisis. Okay, so if we could, ignore this one, then of course the evidence seems to be supportive of the Keynesian stabilization policy. Okay, but at the same time, those people who remain skeptical of the Keynesian economics um, policies would say that, this is probably not because of the Keynesian policies. Instead, it's because of the general public gets better educated in terms of the economics. Okay, so because of the stronger economics background, they can, behave against the cycle or counter cycle. For example, during the recessions, we find more middle class families start buying houses, right? Um, Now, this is because they understand that during the recessions, the interest rates tend to be lower because of the expansionary monetary policy, right? So they want to take advantage of that, even though it might be hard for them to, make the mortgage payment month by month, but they also realize that it's going to be way cheaper for them to borrow um, because of the no interest rate. Okay. Now, when more households start purchasing houses, that will help the economy boost back, right? So again, the skeptics of the Keynesian stabilization policies would say that the smaller fluctuations we saw here is because the a stronger self-correction mechanism. Okay, so when the general public gets better educated, they know how they can save themselves. Okay, their economy. The same thing could happen during the expansions. So the households would start considering, when the economy is doing pretty well, they probably want to save a little more just in case, right? Because we already knew, from the previous discussions that after World War II, the U.S. economy experienced at least one recession in each decade, right? So, when the economy experiences a relatively longer time of expansion, then people may start worrying about, well, probably the next recession is on the horizon, right? I got to be prepared for that. So I want to save a little more. When they save a little more, they cut their consumption or investment. That will help the economy cool down. Okay, so putting together again, you probably would be able to find the competing explanation for this piece of evidence. Okay, as I said, I would like to leave the judgment for you guys to make by yourself. Okay, but here again, as a conclusion of this chapter, I still want to say that this Fred chart in front of you, this is a fact. Okay, this is nothing like um, we're trying to challenge in, okay, or trying to do the critique. Instead, we can challenge the different explanations or interpretations of the fact or the data, right? So that's all about this chapter.